I wanted to thank you all for joining us today. We are doing a webinar responding to sexual abuse allegations at independent schools. This is actually a very unusual webinar for Firestorm. For those of you who participate in our regular webinar series, you'll see and feel the difference because this is actually a learning session that's being brought to you by the Association of Colorado Independent Schools. And I really want to give accolades to ACIS because they are really taking a thought leader position on this issue, as well as the issue of establishing a culture of accountability at independent schools. So you're going to hear a lot more about that today. Also, it's in cooperation with ISU Insurance. Catherine Hansen-Stamp is an attorney who works in a lot of this kind of work, especially organizations involving children. And of course, Firestorm, we're happy to help facilitate this, and this is the work that we do on a day-to-day basis as well. So you'll hear some commentary from me on slides as well. So I am your moderator. I am going to ask various members of the panel today to give their opinions and give you direction on various issues. But before we get started, I do want to point out that this presentation is not complete without the oral comments you're going to hear. Also, we are not attempting to give you legal advice. Anything that you hear, you should read in conjunction and hear in conjunction with all of the other guidance that's being given to you by other authorities and your own counsel. So, our panelists. Today on the phone we have Bill Adams from ISU Insurance. We have Pam Adams from ISU Insurance, Kathy Hansen-Stamp, and Lee Quimby, who many of you I know who is the executive director of ACIS, who has a lot of really great thought around this issue. And so I'll move directly into the presentation. And as you all know, in very recent years, the world has changed. It's not that it has really changed, but the exposure that the issue of sexual abuse in private schools has received as a result of the Spotlight expose has been somewhat overwhelming. For those of you who haven't read the Spotlight articles, I would very much encourage you to do that. And when you get a copy of the slides, and actually I think Karen has already forwarded you all a copy of the slides from today, you'll see the URL at the bottom there. Very much worth reading and understanding the type of victims that they had, the type of abuse that was occurring, the fact that a lot of it is in litigation. It involved so many schools. So, you know, it used to be that when I would talk to heads of school, I would hear very often, well, that couldn't happen here. We know our teachers, we know our families, we know our students. And invariably, with every school that we get involved in, we hear the same thing. We never thought it could happen here. Oh, I've known him for 2 decades. You know, those kind of things. And you're going to hear a lot about that as we go forward in this presentation. I would also encourage any of you who have not looked at the Making Schools Safe website, the sexual abuse that took place at Horace Mann, they have done a detailed analysis of, and there are also tools there that can help you analyze and look at some of the things that you do, the practices and procedures, as well as the planning at your school. So I would encourage you to look at that. So as I pointed out, the ACIS is really providing tremendous perspective on this issue, and I know that Lee has definitive thoughts, and so I'm going to turn the floor over to Lee at this point, and just ask him to comment on the 3 items that are on this slide.
Well, thank you, Harry. I'm just delighted that we have a good group out there representing heads, business managers, communications directors, and some other school associations elsewhere in the country. Some leaders from those organizations have also tuned in. There are three points here on this slide that I wanted to just speak to, just to sort of inform you and to encourage your thoughts and request your assistance, really. So the Spotlight article has the series of articles and the discussions among school association leaders that they have fostered has led to discussion in all the accrediting organizations about whether there needs to be changes in standards or evaluation guidelines for evaluating standards compliance to increase safety and security for students and hold schools accountable for doing what's right. Because as Harry pointed out or implied, because of heightened awareness about this, we're re-examining established practice in many areas. HR practices is one of those areas, and later in this webinar you'll hear a number of comments about orienting teachers, training teachers, raising teachers' awareness. Many different factors contribute to creating a culture of accountability. Background checks is part of that, but that's not going to take care of the whole issue. That's not going to keep any school or student safe. Background checks alone are not enough. Just today I was in a video conference with the executive committee of the Commission on Accreditation, and we were talking about collecting the complaint policies from the different school associations to see how they're set up to respond if someone takes a concern up to that level. That's fairly new. I haven't really looked at ours in that light. And so I just wanted you to know that that thinking is taking place, and I'm always open to suggestions or questions that might support those efforts to re-examine established practice. Next, and this is particularly evident in the detailed studies of certain situations like Horace Mann or South Bank School in England. Those are the two cases I've read in most detail that are publicly available. But in both cases, it was clear that part of the problem, and I think one of the most difficult aspects to address, is the cultural issue. Having good policies and practices is a natural starting place for improving safety, but there also has to be a school culture of vigilance rather than just high trust, that we're all friends here, everybody knows each other, because the little reading and contact that I've had with the most problematic situations has alerted me that the perpetrators of sexual abuse in schools are often people who are extremely charming, socially adept, easy at putting people at ease, and gaining trust. And they're magnets for kids, and this is what I've read. And so high trust, low vigilance doesn't work. We have to work together to create a culture of accountability in our schools, and I welcome ideas on that. The last one is really just an observation that for all the wonderful things about a school's right to determine its own path, choose its own mission, govern itself, all the blessings of independence in our world have a bit of a downside when we address this topic, which is that the school is sort of a little island unto itself, and often the most satisfying response to suspected abuse or clear evidence of abuse is to move that dangerous person out of the school as quickly as possible. And sometimes that motivation leads to decisions that really allow that person to go scot-free and perhaps possibly create trouble elsewhere. I didn't have a chance to check the NAS statistics, but I think the source is Venable Insurance in DC, where they have a figure in one of their publications about how many suspected practitioners of sexual abuse are out there who never get caught. And it's an alarming percentage. As I recall, it was in the 40s, 40 to 50% of the people out there doing abuse never get caught. So I think an underlying theme for this whole webinar is to create a culture of accountability, and that's probably the best solution to this problem of teachers moving on with impunity. And fairly recently, I've seen some really effective collaboration between school heads and communications between heads and boards about people who were never convicted, never prosecuted. The statute of limitations is long past, but they're still out there working in schools. And now we're seeing some communication that can effectively prevent additional difficulties resulting from those people working in schools. And I'd like to see more of that kind of cooperation. I think that's all I have to offer, Harry.
Well, I think that was plenty, Lee. I mean, you covered so many topics there. And as many of you have participated in Firestorm webinars on this topic have heard before, and as we will certainly continue to provide content both through ACIS and through the normal process, each one of these issues that Lee has laid out, we could do not only an entire webinar on, we could do days of discussion on. As a matter of fact, it was wonderful yesterday in preparing for this webinar. We pulled together the same group, the presenters, and we had a 2-hour conversation about issues involving sexual abuse, how do we prevent it, and one of the things Lee just brought up, for example, the fact that these perpetrators are very often very charismatic people. You know, I'm a parent. Most of the people on this call are parents. You know, we used to teach our kids about stranger danger. It's really not the strangers that are the problem. So do they need to be incorporated into your planning process? Absolutely. But you'll hear as we go on, there are lots of other problems. The world pretty much has stayed the same, you know, so just this was an example out of the paper just recently, or actually off of the ABC website, of a teacher that was able to move between schools with some impunity. Interestingly, the world is still the same, because after we got off of the call yesterday with this group, Firestorm had one of its client schools call with a new allegation of sexual abuse. So it is happening. It is still happening. Lee pointed out that a lot of perpetrators never get caught. I think it's also important to understand there are always new perpetrators. You know, there are young people who are coming up through the system, some of whom have mental illness or whatever their issue is that causes them to be a perpetrator. There are new ones coming up every day. So that's an important thing as well, because a lot of independent schools, a lot of private schools hire very young people just out of college, and they haven't been in the system in a way that their behaviors of concern that they exhibit would have been noticed or could have been caught. So we'll talk more about that as we go on. So this is the title slide, which I put back up just because we've talked more just in these last few minutes, not just about responding to sexual abuse allegations, but sort of more the culture that surrounds it. So we're going to go now into what is it really, when we talk about responding to sexual abuse, that we're responding to. Obviously, the spotlight articles are focused on allegations of sexual abuse from adult alumni made against previous staff. But we also get allegations of adult alumni where the teacher or the perpetrator, who might be a coach, might be a janitor, might even be just a member of the local community, is still in contact with the school or is still working at the school. We also have allegations being made by current victims against current staff, so students who are still in our schools. Those are all very different things. The last one, I'm going to actually open up the floor. I would like Kathy for you to cover this one, because I know you have issues about all of the other things that go on at independent schools. So why don't you cover this for us?
Okay, well, so this is Kathy. I was just going to caution you. I think in reading the articles as schools looking at what's going on out there, there's a temptation to kind of compartmentalize your response. You read an article and you say, well, we've got that covered. That's not going to happen at our school. But I urge you to think, and you'll hear more about this, you know, looking proactively at analyzing what your risks are, but think about the other things. And Harry's raised a few: camps, after-school deliveries, etc. But I thought further about things like off-campus programming. That could be school tripping. That could be a field trip in the state of Colorado or any other state. It could be in a U.S. or an international location. And think about where could abuse happen in our school. Think about the various layers of staff that you have. You have full-time staff, and in addition you have volunteers. You could have parents, apprentices, interns for on or off-campus programming. Think about when you might be partnering with another organization to conduct a program. A lot of my schools and clients do that. And so you may have done the screening and due diligence you think you need to do with your own staff, but then you're partnering and interfacing with others who may be dealing with your students. And also think about when you're using perhaps a contracted vendor to conduct a trip. Some of your school staff may be attending that. Or you may be using homestays, another one where issues have come up. So I just encourage you to look wider than what you're reading about. And the other important thing, avoid thinking just about staff or third-party to student sexual misconduct, because you're going to have potentially child-to-child. You also may very well have children relaying to school staff or to summer staff, if you'd have camp programs, things that happened elsewhere. They didn't happen at school, but there's something happening with their parent or their uncle or their coach, and that may trigger a reporting obligation on your part. And also another layer to think about, this is all in addition, what we're talking about today, to the school's ongoing attention to addressing sexual abuse and harassment among staff to staff, and that is a separate but important issue. So these are all layers for you to be thinking about. Thanks, Harry.
No, that was, very important. And it's interesting. Firestorm has handled the case this summer of a school that had a young teacher in India on a school trip with a young 16-year-old girl, and exactly what you said became a problem. I mean, it was a school trip, so that the normal procedures where they never allowed a teacher or, they had the rule of 3 where they always had at least 2 students or 2 teachers
right
at any time, that those procedures broke down and resulted in a problem. So I think you've got to look at all your plans, processes, and procedures when you're going through those things, because that's, it's where the things slip through the cracks often that the problems occur.
Right.
So what's changing? When we talk about the world changing and the world being the same, one of the things that's happened, and that I know those of you who are heads of school are battling with every day, is technology. The access to information, the access to all of these technological tools that allow wonderful things to happen, allow changes in teaching, allow interaction with other countries and other, all kinds of great things, also create all types of very difficult problems. Just before you all got on this call, we were talking about the dark web. Karen Masulo, who you heard at the beginning of this call, who's in charge of Firestorm's intelligence department, there are things that go on that you need to be aware of, but that you're probably not. So that's again a topic for a whole nother day. But technology has changed, and it's changing at an ever-increasing rate. So things like Snapchat, so the kids can make it so that we, their parents, and the people who are responsible for overseeing them can't see what they're doing. Those kind of things. Also, this millennial generation, 2 of which belong to me. I have a daughter and a son in that group. The way they think, the way that they interact, the way that they use technology is just so different, and they are soon to be, if they're not already, your employees and your teachers as well. So you need to be aware and adjust your approach. That culture that Lee referred to has to be adjusted so that they hear the message the way you're trying to transmit it to them, because they hear differently. So what's implied and what's inferred sometimes are very different with this generation. So also, I think awareness. when you talk about awareness of sexual abuse and sexual molestation issues, you know, the spotlight issues, what's happening right now with Bill Cosby and all of that, there's just a higher level of awareness. And lastly, I think victims' rights, the willingness of victims to speak out, the number of organizations that are there supporting the victims, both in a positive way, by the way, and not necessarily so positive. There are support organizations that really are the feeders for the plaintiff's bar that are looking, they're sort of out there trolling for victims, and the problem that I have with that is they don't necessarily assist the victim in getting the help that they really need. So that's a whole separate topic again.
Harry, I was going to add, I was going to add one more thing. The other thing, and this kind of cuts both ways, but just so you know, the courts are cooperating more in the sense that I think they're paying more attention to the issues out there when they have a case before them. And I was so pleased to see that a few years ago the Oregon Supreme Court ordered the Boy Scouts to release thousands of internal, what they call perversion records, after many courts in the past and decisions I'd read had said that those files were privileged, which didn't make any sense to me. And finally, a court had the guts to say, no, these are not privileged, and release those, which resulted in a significant jury verdict against the Boy Scouts. And I don't mean to pick on them, but the point is the courts are seeing, you know, these things have to get out there. And that cuts both ways, but I think it's accountability as well for the organizations that are performing that have policies in place that really don't make sense. So I wanted to add that.
I think you're exactly right, and I think one of the things that we're going to see more and more is that pendulum swinging in that direction, where they used to really try and protect the organizations. The pendulum has now swung the other way, and they're absolutely taking every effort they can. If they can open a door where more information gets out, they are going to open that door. So,
yeah.
Let's see, my screen. There we go. So one of the questions I've received from a few heads of school as well as from several of Firestorm's clients is why all of a sudden are we seeing a much greater increase in the type of claims from older alumni? And one of the answers is the statute of limitations has been changed in a lot of states. And Colorado, like a lot of those states, has extended the statute of limitations. So as you all may know, just recently Governor Hickenlooper signed into law a new statute of limitations doubling the statute for sexual assault. And that type of a thing, combined with what we were just talking about, where victims don't feel as stigmatized, where they feel it's okay to come out and say, I was a victim of sexual abuse, is making it so that there's a lot more exposure. Also, the media, as you've seen, love this issue. You know, I do a lot of media training with some of the people on this call as well as with the associations, and you know, the media has gone from being a trusted source where they provide information that's accurate to being entertainment. They look to create controversy. They want to show things that really make people uncomfortable as much as anything else. And so this issue is very high on their priority. So I don't know if any of the other panelists, if you'd like to comment on this issue, but this is a real change that we've seen, and it's going to continue.
Well, I was going to make one comment, Harry. I honestly, when I first saw this slide that Harry had put together, I was a little confused as to why he was focused on criminal statute of limitation, that is criminal law. But I get it now in the sense that that's why we're seeing more of this. But I wanted to just distinguish that what Harry is talking about is the criminal statute of limitations. And I'm not saying that a school wouldn't be subject to a criminal offense of some kind, but typically, and I'll say that pretty loosely, the crime, if there is a crime, it is against the individual where an allegation has been made. Typically, a school might be brought into a lawsuit under civil law, which would be perhaps the tort of negligent supervision, negligent selection of something like that in relation to a sexual abuse charge. And there are some limits on that statute in Colorado. It is, there's some flexibility in there in terms of when you discover it, or if you are a minor when the incident occurs, then you have some time until the time you reach 18, or when you reasonably would think that you had been assaulted. So there's some flexibility there, but there is a statute that has a limit. But the point is, even if the statute has run for the claim, and so the school will not be sued, they are still going to have, as Harry has pointed out and will, all of the crisis response that they will want to be doing in terms of dealing with the family, dealing with the victim, dealing with reputational issues and all of that. And there may be no insurance to cover that in the sense that that those costs come independent of a lawsuit. Although, as Harry may point out later, that may be changing. But I think it's important to understand that difference.
Well, it's a great difference, because if it says on the front page of the Denver Post tomorrow, XYZ school head or XYZ school teacher found guilty of sexual abuse, it doesn't matter whether the statute of limitations has run. The brand and reputation exposure and all of the other problems still come right to the forefront. So we will definitely talk more about that as we go on.
Mrs. Lee, I'm glad you made that point, Harry. What I'm hearing from my colleagues around the country is, because of the film Spotlight, which was about sexual abuse in the Catholic Church in the Boston area, and because of more and more articles where victims are coming forward and their name is being shared publicly associated with these unfortunate incidents, I think one of the things that have changed, to return to Harry's theme, is that the stigma and avoidance of public attention seems to be lesser than it used to be, so that victims are more willing to come forward and tell their story. And that increases the possibility and the risk that any one of our schools could have a newspaper story, like Harry was saying. Regardless of what's happened with the statute of limitations and how long ago it was, the school's reputation could be damaged.
That's really true.
By a victim coming forward, and that's why we need to get ready for that possibility.
Well, every one of our schools has to have in place a crisis management plan that includes a crisis communications plan that has specific authorities in it, messages that are already pre-formatted, so that everyone knows what to say, what not to say, and that's probably the most important thing. It's not what you do and what you say. It's what you don't do and what you don't say that often become important in these situations. So, again, that's a whole topic for another day, because how you develop your overall crisis management plan after having done thorough vulnerability and threat analysis. Again, there are lots of those webinars that we've already done. Anyone who wants to see them, please feel free. They're free on the Firestorm website. And if you have any questions, we'd be happy to. By the way, on the bottom of on the side of your panel for this webinar, there is a place where you can put in questions or comments or anything that you'd like us to address. Karen is monitoring that. So if you do have something that you'd like to ask the group or you want follow-up on, don't hesitate to type that in while we're talking. So this slide, response to whom? When we talk about response to sexual abuse, the response to every one of the individuals or groups on this page is different. Now, there's a certain amount of consistency in terms of what the message is, but the way you respond to a victim, which better be included in your planning process, is very different than the way you're going to respond to the perpetrator, which is very different than the regulators and the media. So I'm not going to go into each one of these individually, but you need to, as part of your vulnerability and threat analysis, before you start your planning process, you have to identify the constituents with whom you are going to need to communicate and going to need to have a plan for addressing the response. Does anyone else on the panel want to comment on this slide? Okay, moving on. So just before this webinar started, I modified this slide. It used to just say, what do they expect, without the quotes. And Kathy asked me, well, who's they? And the they on this slide, I was referring to this group of people. What do they expect? Well, obviously, the victim expects something very different than prospective families, which is very different than alumni and contributors. So, as some of you may know, Firestorm was the response firm that responded to the shootings at Virginia Tech. The way we got there was through one of their largest contributing alumni. Those people expect a whole different kind of communications. They don't expect to get an email from you. They expect the head of school to pick up the phone and tell them what's going on before there's any public announcement. If you haven't included that in your crisis management plan and in your crisis communications plan, you will forget, because you go into this hypervigilant mode, and if you don't have a detailed process to go through and follow, you will miss steps, you will skip steps, you will miss people, and then you get into my world, which is what I call consequence management. Typically, by the time Firestorm gets involved in one of these situations, the crisis is long over. The teacher or whomever has been arrested, it's all, that's all done. The crisis is over. We're now managing the consequences. And so the people who are on this call, I mean, whether it's Kathy or whether it's Bill and Pam, we're all, or Firestorm, we're all managing consequences and different aspects, in some cases, of consequences. We work together as a team to holistically deal with the consequences. But it's a very important thing to understand. So again, those of you who know Firestorm know we follow a very simple methodology, which is predict, plan, perform. Well, each of the they have different understanding of what we're doing in those different phases. So, if you're a government regulator, if you're regulating schools, or if you're inspecting a school for whatever reason it might be, what you expect from a prediction and a planning standpoint could be very different than what a prospective parent may want to hear about. Now, Kathy, I did add in on this slide some of your key areas. I'd love for you to comment on some of the things that you view as being an expectation.
Sure. So, yeah, I wanted to, first off, I think this is a good spot to say this, and if anyone there has ever heard me speak, I tend to begin this way. I mean, I think when you sort of roll this back and think about, why are we doing this? What is the impetus for this? It's really you want to run a quality program. You want to run a quality school. And in this, we're not on this phone. We're not doing what we're doing here just to scare you about litigation, just to alarm you and have you run to protect your reputation. Although all of those, it's important to protect your reputation, the consideration here is a balanced approach to both managing the risk of loss to the students and, of course, to your staff as well. I mean, there may be an unfounded allegation if we don't have a plan in place that takes into consideration risks to the staff, but also to the school. So we want to think about the kids, we want to think about the staff, and we want to think about what is the risk of loss to the school if something bad happens. And I just think it's important to keep that in mind rather than just your motivation being afraid of a lawsuit or being afraid of some announcement. We want to be prepared for lots of good reasons. And so, I just put a few things down here that I think are important. I haven't, predict, plan, perform is great. I have a few other words, but they're, they all kind of boil down to helping you have a system for thinking about these things from the top down. The thing that rather than just reading this slide, I mean, I've raised some important things there that can go obviously much deeper. But I think it's important for you to understand that in my talk, and I know I talked with Harry earlier today about this, there has been an absolute game changer around the way that organizations and experts are looking at how to manage these kinds of risks. It is totally different. So I just have to say, the old plan, if there ever was one, wasn't working. So if we go back to, and Harry and I laughed about the stranger danger, that's how I taught my kids. But if we just go back, let's say 20 years, before AAU, before Penn State, before, the Boy Scouts, the Roman Catholic Church, we think about, what was going on then? First of all, this wasn't really on anyone's radar screen. And if it was hushed. And if there was anything, it perhaps was, we'll do a background check. And as somebody pointed out earlier, I think it was Lee, we found that, I'm not necessarily good at statistics, but one of that I've heard is, less than 10% of folks are going to be found, even with a very thorough check. They may not have a record. This may be their first time. And so I think you need to understand that it's worth looking at what are some of these new processes to really try and manage this risk in terms of active screening, in terms of educating your staff about what is abuse and what is appropriate conduct, and what are some of the guidelines. So I think that's an important thing. And then the last thing that I wanted to say about this slide is this is really the beginning of helping you to think about, okay, where do we even start? Where do we go from the top down to look at what our plan is going to be? And it's important to evaluate the risks, as Harry has on your exposure analysis, and think about how we're going to manage those and come up with a plan. But I think one key thing is to remember that if you develop a plan, it's a live plan. It should be flexible. It should be doable. It should be something that your school can put their arms around and train on and prepare for. If it isn't that, if it's just going to go up on a dusty shelf, then it's going to hurt you in the end. So if you feel like it's not working, think about how it can. You know your own school culture. You may be a small school, you may be a very large school, but the plan needs to consider the current risk management approach to some of these issues, as well as what is going to work for you, what is going to roll out on the ground that you're actually going to go with, and that's important to remember.
Can I add something?
Yeah, please.
And this something Kathy just said reminded me of this. I guess I could have shared it earlier. The ACIS just in January approved a comprehensive revision of accreditation standards. They include two new standards that we didn't have before. One is on risk management, and the other is on crisis management planning. And Mike Davis, who I think is on the phone, he's head of Colorado Academy, he and I are on the accreditation committee. We're drafting evaluation guidelines for assessing how schools are doing in these two areas, risk management and crisis management planning. So this webinar will inform some of the guidelines that we create, and in future evaluation teams will gradually improve our efforts at guiding schools and holding them accountable for doing good work in these areas in response to the changing times that Kathy and Harry have been telling us about. I just wanted you to know that's one institutional change that's already happened, and now we're working on implementing it.
Well, I think that's great, Lee. And the other thing I was going to add was simply that, as Harry and I talked about, this this is just one part of your crisis response planning, and this particular set of issues you're talking about today, it has to ultimately dial into your overall school crisis response plan. So, the point is, there's going to be perhaps a school, media response, or maybe you have a tiered approach to risk management. This obviously needs to sort of intersect with that on certain levels, and so that's good to hear, Lee, that you're moving forward on some of that.
I think it shows that the ACIS is, again, as I pointed out earlier in the call, it's taking a leadership position, and it's the kind of thing that all of us on this call are happy to help promote. We're happy to help any of the organizations that are going to protect our children. So I'm going to move along through. I'm not going to stop on each of these slides because I'm loving the conversation, but we now are 40 minutes into our webinar, and I do want to cover a couple of additional things, because one of the things that I think is essential for everyone to understand is the insurance piece of it. So I'm going to quickly go through some of these slides. So for example, this one, we all know in today's world, reports can come in from a whole bunch of places. Being aware, having a social media monitoring plan, having an anonymous reporting system at your school. You, I know, have implemented Safe to Tell, which is a Colorado-based program, but there are other systems out there. And all of these are an integral piece of your planning process. You know, historically, we've heard, when you read through the Horace Mann and some of the other reports, you're going to see victims have not been handled well. We need to make sure, as part of your planning process and as part of that culture that Lee talks about of accountability, we are accountable to those victims. We need to make sure that they are handled in the appropriate way. So one of the questions, we just had this with one of our clients, was to report or not to report. This was not a sexual abuse situation. This was actually a communicable illness situation that we had. But they weren't going to report it to their insurance carrier because they were afraid of the ramifications, and they therefore weren't going to report it to the Department of Health because similarly they were afraid that the word would get out. Pam or Bill, I would love for you to talk a little bit on this slide about what the failure to report could mean to an insured.
Gotcha. Well, thanks, Harry, and this is Pam, and you know, it's something many of you might have heard Bill and I talk about that we're not proud of in our industry, but a lot of times the big print give us and the small print take us away, and that's certainly the case when it comes to reporting responsibilities that you have within your various insurance policies. And there are definitely areas where there are requirements of duties to report in a certain amount of time based on the situation, whether it's an actual claim or just an incident, that by not doing that you could jeopardize whether your coverage exists at all for that situation. So reporting quickly and to the right folks is key in all of these.
Kathy, I don't know if you want to comment at all about, at this point, because we can get into it a little further on, just about the mandated reporter requirements for all schools.
Yeah, sure. I just would say that, you know, there is a Colorado, like I think every other state, has a reporting statute, and they are all slightly different, so it's important to understand what Colorado says, and I frankly think it's an important part of your training of your staff, not only the heads but also the staff on the ground, so they understand what it really means. And interestingly, both in Colorado, we have what we call a list of mandatory reporters. Wyoming, for example, anyone is a mandatory reporter. But here we have both public school officials and staff are mandatory reporters, which creates kind of an interesting situation. And so hence why it's important to have as part of your plan, what is your reporting sort of policy? And we've talked about the value among us of reporting up the chain so that if something happens within your school, there's a plan that even though the staff member is a mandatory reporter, that they report up the chain, and there's a policy that the school undertakes in terms of how that report is handled. But it basically, in Colorado, if you have reasonable cause to know or believe that abuse has occurred, then you have potentially a reporting obligation. Now, Colorado says immediately report, and I know Harry has talked with us, we've talked about the fact that immediately doesn't mean the second it occurs. You want to take a deep breath and think about you know, what you're going to do, and hopefully you already have a plan in place about how that's going to take place. And Harry may want to talk about this, but he suggested perhaps that the attorney for the school may be doing the reporting. I thought about perhaps the idea of the attorney working with the staff member to be there to do the reporting. That may help. But Harry talks a lot about the fact that when you do report it, there's a certain amount of information you need to give, but oftentimes you may be asked far more than that. So being prepared to know how to report and what to do is important. But having a plan is key, and letting your staff understand that there is a culture, and that if you don't report, it can be a crime. As he says here, there is, I believe it's a misdemeanor, or maybe it's, I'm not sure, maybe Harry has that in front of him, but the point is it can be a crime. There is immunity, provided for good faith reporting, so that if you in good faith believe you have to report, then you will not be held responsible if you're wrong. And so there's a lot of encouragement there to report. But obviously reporting is important. And another point in the statute is that there is an exception to the reporting if the person who is in the position to have to report is dealing with someone who's over 18. And so there may be a reason why you do not need to report a particular crime if the person who is being alleged to have been the criminal in the case is not in a position where they could be abusing at this point or in that. So it's important to understand what the ins and outs of the statute are.
The mandated reporter plan is part of both your emergency response plan, because obviously emergency response is life safety and safety issues. Obviously, mandated reporter is included there. It's also part of your crisis communications plan. And we don't have the time to go into that today, but if you don't have a plan, you've got nothing to train to. And we've had 2 schools where teachers have picked up the phone and called the regulator directly because that was their mandated reporter responsibility. And the problem is you get that person on the phone with a regulator who's very good at asking questions, and the teacher doesn't know, because they haven't been adequately trained, what questions they're supposed to answer and which ones are not within their purview. And of course the regulator makes them feel like you better answer this question. So again, we don't have time to get into this in detail as to what a mandated reporter plan looks like, but every school on this phone needs to have one as part of your overall process. And if you have questions about that, we can definitely talk further about that offline. So, insurance reporting we just talked about. I think one of the things that Bill and Pam would be happy to talk to any of you about is, questions like, is there coverage? Which policies? Because, you've got overlapping policies in a lot of situations with general liability, sexual abuse and molestation, your directors and officers policies. Some of you now have standalone policies that provide specific peril coverage. Again, we don't have time to get into that today, but somebody needs to lay out for you what that net looks like and where there are gaps in the coverage. It's important to know that now in peacetime before anything comes up. Again, if you went back to the earlier slides, the different types of claims. So a claim from 20 or 30 years ago from an alumni may or may not be covered, and it would be covered very differently in all likelihood than a current claim from a current student. So Bill or Pam, could you quickly just give us a 1-minute lesson on the difference between claims made and occurrence?
Sure, Harry. This is Pam again. And it sounds pretty obvious when you read a definition of an occurrence policy or claims made policy, but occurrence policies are really there to provide coverage for claims or incidents that occur or that actually happen during that particular policy period, whereas claims made policies provide coverage for claims that are made or actually suits that are filed against you during that particular policy period. So if you think of situations where abuse happened many years ago, it's that policy that was actually in place, the general liability policy or the abuse and molestation policy, that would likely respond to those types of situations. So tracking down those policies from years ago is really important. Current Colorado regulations really only require insurance carriers to keep copies of policies for the calendar year that the policy starts in, as well as 2 additional years. So the carriers themselves aren't really required to keep copies of those for a very long time. They put the burden back on you to do that, and of course your brokers can help in the process too. But what then you see is that you've maybe got this occurrence that happened years ago, but you're worried about, well, gosh, our directors and officers and how they're handling this situation now. Well, that's where you're going to to have a claims made policy likely in place, and so it's your current policy that you want to know the ins and outs of, in terms of how you respond. And just one more bit of background is, your general liability, your abuse and molestation policies, they're providing coverage for bodily injury or property damage that occurred. That's why they're the policies that will typically go to, or that will go to when, an incident occurs, whereas the directors and officers liability are really there to cover decisions and financial loss or such, the results from a decision. So how your board or head of school, your board of trustees, how they respond to a situation today, that may be where coverage comes into play for, did you handle it well, or did the handling of it result in lots of contributions, lots of students, which then resulted in lots of money to the organization. Bill, anything you'd add that I might have missed or such?
No, I think you covered it well, Pam. I think the key is, though, that Harry's mentioned many times, and Lee, the issue of risk management, which is much broader than the issue of insurance. Insurance only comes to play in one part of risk management, which we call the transfer part, where you try to transfer the responsibility, at least the financial responsibility, to someone else. But a lot about what we're talking about today in the planning is avoiding risk or mitigating risk, or if there is no coverage, how you proceed when you need to assume the risk yourself.
And I think,
thank you. This is Lee. I have a question for Bill and Pam. Is that okay?
yeah, of course.
Maybe it's an obvious question. I don't know why this didn't come up when we were planning for this, but do you recommend that all schools have a current claims-made policy so that they at least have that coverage if an alumni comes forward about something that happened a decade ago or more?
Lee, the issue is the type of policy. Go ahead.
All of the insurance people on the call were about to jump in. We all have the gut reaction. But Pam or Bill, why don't you answer that question?
Well, I think what I would add is just that typically you don't necessarily have the choice of whether your policy is an occurrence-based policy or a directors and officers liability. There are a few carriers who have now started to offer claims-made general liability or abuse and molestation policies, but they're kind of few and far between. That's just very much been traditionally an occurrence-based policy. And then on the opposite of that, I can't think of anyone that would offer a directors and officers liability on an occurrence-based policy. That's all going to be claims made. And claims made, while maybe we've made it sound better in certain situations, isn't always the case, because it may not cover claims made, and not to get into too much detail, but there's typically a retroactive date. So we may cover all claims that have occurred before the retroactive date of your policy. Well, if the retroactive date is only, the year 2000, and the incidents causing rise to a claim, today occurred in 1995, then that claims made policy might not respond. So typically I would say it's a lot based on availability, as well as based on, some additional logistics of those claims made policies, whether that's what you'd really be looking to obtain.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I just had to ask, a little obvious, but I know many schools that have a part of their chapter, often back in the 60s and 70s, when all kinds of crazy stuff happened. And the current heads, they have some intimation of that. And so I'm sure there are a lot of people wondering, well, can we just buy a policy now that would make it all good? It's not that easy.
Wouldn't that be great?
No, they cannot. The retroactive date is going to prevent that from happening. And that's one of the reasons, this slide that's currently up, that's why it's important to know, where do you have no coverage? Where are you exposed? And working with your insurance agent and broker, as Pam pointed out, working with your insurance professionals to find those policies and identify for yourself those resources. So if you're going to need lawyers and crisis managers and people to respond, you want to make sure that those are people who know how to respond in those situations, because it's a high level of specialization. I mean, the staff at Firestorm has handled literally thousands of sexual molestation allegations. And, you know, we can see and know what's coming next. And you got to make sure, similarly, you know, Kathy, who's on the phone, this is an area of specialty. Lee, you know, obviously has tremendous experience and knowledge in this area. Bill and Pam, similarly, ensure many, many schools. So you want to make sure you're working with people who have an expertise in the area that you're looking for, because that's going to become so important. You know, I am not in any way advocating this firm whose slide you see up here. I created this slide just to let you know that as a result of the changes in the statute of limitations and what's going on in the world today, there's a new area of insurance archaeology. People who are just going out there to try and find all of your decades-old insurance policies. Now, Pam, I think, why don't you point out that before they go to someone like this, you had some thoughts?
I do, and that's just contact your current broker, at least in regard to your situation, because often your current broker will know who you were with prior to being with them, or just have suggestions before you start paying money to an outside firm. At least contact your current folks that you work with to see if they have any suggestions or thoughts, or access to resources that might help in addition to that. But I was glad too to learn that these types of folks are out there in the event there really is a pinch and you need them.
But again, one of the things I really want to emphasize to everybody is the time to do this is now, in peacetime. So often we get into a crisis situation and we ask, okay, what are the what are the parameters? What are the policies that are in place? And people start digging at that point. And it's a real problem, because we could wind up in a late notice situation where we take lots of steps and we implement lots of processes and procedures that the insurer subsequently disagrees with, or says, look, we didn't give approval for this and therefore it's not covered. So very important that you work with your insurance agent now on those type of things. We talked already about mandated reporting. One of the things that has come up recently with mandated reporter, before you ever report one of these older claims where an alumni comes to you and talks about a situation that occurred years ago, you need to understand that in most states that we, Firestorm, have dealt with, when the report has been made, we have been told by the Department of Child Services, or whatever it's called in that particular state, that we only handle cases where the victim is currently a child. And the problem with reporting it is, once you report it and it goes into their closed file, which it instantly will because it's an adult, it becomes public information in a lot of places. So again, Kathy's idea of reporting up the chain, of making sure that you've got a policy and a procedure in place that will get your counsel involved and will make sure that you follow the right process and procedure, is imperative, because otherwise you could wind up creating your own media and social media nightmare without having it have been necessary, which then, of course, leads us to another one of the issues which Lee and I have gone back and forth on extensively, which is, how do you then notify your community? Obviously, the issue of transparency becomes very important in all of these sexual abuse situations. And what I want everybody to focus on, and I know we're pretty much at the top of the hour now, but there's a huge difference between transparency and full disclosure. So if you go back to that list of who we need to communicate with, we're going to be transparent with everybody, but we are not necessarily going to give the same information to everybody. So again, that has to be part of your program. It has to be part of your overall crisis management and crisis communications program that everybody's been trained to. And probably the most important thing that Firestorm does in a crisis, for any school or any organization is first get them to slow down. Everyone is moving so fast and trying to make decisions. And the other thing is, and this is something you all can implement today, is making sure that everyone understands they are not a designated spokesperson for the organization. No one has the authority to speak until the individual, typically the head of school or the head of the board or whatever it is, approves the plan and the strategy and says, okay, you, Mr. Head of School, are authorized to now speak in these ways with these modalities to these specific customers or constituents. So again, all of that needs to be incorporated into the process, because otherwise you will have failures, and again, you will get into that consequence management mode where we are trying to fix mistakes that were made during the crisis response process. So I am going to ask each of our panelists today to give us a closing comment. So Bill, you want to start us off? Because you've been the most quiet on the call.
Well, Harry, my comment is that all the people on the webinar, don't be afraid to ask for help. You have volunteered numerous times to be available. You've made many of your services available to ACIS members initially in the analysis portion at no charge. Pam and I stand ready to help anyone. Lee has always been available. Kathy and our firm have worked together for a number of years, so don't be bashful would be my only comment.
I think it's a great comment, and just so everybody does know, Firestorm services are available to any school or any organization free of charge for that first hour of our consulting services. We call it Crisis Stop because we want to prevent people from making those common crisis errors. So don't hesitate to pick up the phone and call. And again, we should get to know you now in peacetime so that when the first call we get isn't when your hair's on fire. So that said, Pam, what do you got for us?
Thanks, Harry. I think I would just reiterate too, yeah, the time is now when things are calm and such to start thinking of these things. I think most people think, well, gosh, we've done the proactive thing of at least purchasing insurance and making sure that's in place, but there are other things that we can help with in terms of making sure you understand well the types of insurance you've got and when you should call us, when it's not peacetime too, but again, just thinking of insurance more proactively, not just in the purchase of it, but of the understanding of it.
Great. Kathy?
Well, so I just want to say, all the people, I've really enjoyed conversing with all of you on the phone here the last couple of days, and I've learned a lot. And I'm going to be a little philosophical here and just say that in the last point on this last slide, the other folks that are dependent on you having a proper plan are your students and your staff. Their well-being rests upon you thoughtfully thinking through a plan. And I think of that, you probably heard this, the boy on the sand, and he's throwing the starfish back in, and there's thousands of them on the beach. Well, that one starfish that matters, and one child matters in this kind of a case. So remember that when you're thinking about your priority list as you go back to the office after this call.
Thank you. Lee?
Great. Well, thank you, Harry. I'd like to work with you, Harry, on creating a simple one-page list of takeaway guidance for school leaders, including some of the slides we haven't had a chance to discuss. But the two that I've taken away from this very clearly is every school should do some sort of comprehensive vulnerability and threat analysis that includes looking at insurance gaps in coverage and creates a crisis response plan that anticipates a variety of possible crises, anticipates a variety of possible audiences that need to be communicated with. And just saying those two things, that's a big piece of work. And I know that a bunch of ACIS schools haven't done that or haven't done it very recently. And but I'll talk with you, Harry, about creating a list of takeaways from this webinar that I can send out with the web link because we will record this, and that will be available to everyone who's on the call and everyone who is invited. So thank you a lot, all of you, Les and Harry. This is very helpful.
Well, thank you. And if everybody could take away just those two things that you mentioned and actually get them done, we will have improved the quality and the safety and security of the students, faculty, and staff at all of these schools. I know numerous of you wrote in questions in the question block. We will follow up with each of you to make sure that you get the answers to those questions. And if it's something Firestorm can answer, we certainly will. If it's something we need to allocate out to the other individuals, the panelists on this call, we will do that as well. This topic obviously is one that is very important to all of you on the call. It's also what the panelists and what Firestorm do all day, every day. So keep in mind, your job is to run a school, to run it safely and successfully. Our job is to be aware of best practices and always be helping you to continuously improve the things that we know about. Don't feel the need to reinvent those wheels because we're here for you doing that. Don't hesitate to reach out to us because, again, this is what we do. So, Lee, I want to thank the ACIS for the leadership in this area. If anyone has any, again, further questions, don't hesitate to reach out to Lee. Certainly don't hesitate to reach out to any of the other panelists on this call. And with that being said, that is the end of today's webinar. So thank you all very much.
Thank you for joining today. This will conclude our webinar. You can learn more at the ACIS website or at firestorm.com. Thank you.